JT Crowley is talking books. On the show, you'll hear from emerging talent and seasoned veterans from around the world.
Hello, I'm JT Crowley, the host of Talking Book Show on Web Talk Radio. And today I welcome back Griff Ruby from California in the United States of America to talk about his book, The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, a guide to the traditional Catholic community. In our last interview, we discussed his book, Sede Vacante. So while on this occasion we're focusing on the resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, have a look at Sede Vacante, his book. It's very, very interesting. Now, I suggest, as I said, go and have a look at both the books. But this podcast, we are just focusing on the resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, a guide to the traditional Catholic community. So who is Griff Ruby? Well, let's bring him on the show so that he can talk to us and he can fill us all in. So I'm going to ask him to come and join me. Griff, come and join me on the show.
And here I am. Well, I can't tell you how great it is to see you again. You know, it's been more than maybe almost 2 years I've had to wait for this opportunity. So I'm glad we're both able to reconvene again. So this is great.
Absolutely. Yes, this is our second interview. Yes, and it has taken a little while to get it together, everybody. Now, Griff, before we delve into your book, The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, which is fascinating, and when you look at the written introduction, everybody, you will find out that Griff he's got his own strong viewpoints. You might agree with him, you might not, but you need to read the book and then decide for yourself, do you agree with some of his viewpoints or don't? Because he can be quite controversial, but the book is brilliantly written. An awful lot of work has gone into this book. Anyway, that's just my blurb. Griff, would you care to tell us who you are again and what's the backdrop to this book of yours?
So I was raised in a family that didn't, good people in the usual sense of the word, but there is no religion in the home. And that void needed to be filled at some point. So it started for me when I was 14 and the Gideons came to my high school and handed out these little free, they said Bibles, but it's just the New Testament plus Psalms and Proverbs. Rather unusual about this edition is that it's actually the revised Berkeley version and not the King James that they seem to have handed out or given or provided to hotels at literally every other occasion. So it's kind of an interesting little artifact from my youth that started this whole thing. But what was, God and Jesus Christ? It's amazing having read that for the first time. I knew nothing of the story of Christ. I didn't know. I'd heard the name, but I had no idea what his life was or what he did or what he said or that he gets crucified. And I certainly hadn't expected that he comes back to life. So it's kind of interesting reading that, not as a child hearing this all the time and you just kind of get used to it, but as a 14-year-old kid seeing this and going, hey, this is that? That happens? Whoa, whoa. So I had to learn a huge learning curve from there to wanting to know more about what's going on. And as you listen to me talk, I won't sound quite the same as my other. I'm recovering from a cold, and there was a lot of coughing in recent weeks, and it's kind of shredded my voice. So this is my old man's voice. So as a preview, I hope it gets better again. So you just have to be patient with me on that. So anyway, I thought about these things and I learned and I studied and I went through a variety of different things. And at the time, each kind of seemed like maybe this could be it. And I don't know, maybe this would be it. And they each got closer and closer and closer. And when I finally arrived at being a traditional Catholic, that's when I really knew that, this is it. So if any of all of this is true, this is where it all lands. So about the book. Now, the book got started, I first corresponded with a traditional Catholic in 1991. It was an ex-nun of a group that, well, she was on her own now because she had left them. But she still believed in being a Catholic. She just kind of felt there wasn't anybody out there she could trust, so she just kind of had to do it all on her own. But she still had her friends up at a place in Spokane. She was living there too, just at the top of the mountain, just a little northeast of Spokane. There's a huge Jesuit facility that has, I count it as one of those few grand old Catholic facilities that is distinct for being still in Catholic hands, because most of the great things are not really in Catholic hands anymore. A terrible tragedy, but this place is, and it's really, I went up there, she pointed me up there, says, you need to see a real traditional mass. I hadn't seen one before. Well, I'd seen a Latin mass one time. We did have an ultra-conservative parish in my town, and as a one-shot, they did a Latin mass, and I thought, well, this was neat, but I was kind of wowed. He did everything in Latin, including the homily. I was like, this is great, kind of intimidating, but that was it, and I didn't know really what I was looking at, but it was my first very brief exposure. Now we get to this place here that the ex-nun had pointed me up to on the mountain, and there they had a full mass, they had a congregation, they had a school full of kids, kindergarten through 12th grade. They had a little bookstore, kind of a first stage seminary, a convent. I mean, it was amazing what they had there. And I was just so impressed with what I saw and what the mass was. And it was like, where has this been all my life? So I wanted to know more about it. And that's when I wanted a book like what my resurrection book actually is. It didn't exist. But I wanted it badly enough that I decided, well, if it doesn't exist, then maybe I'll have to make it exist. Well, that was a lot of study, and I spent 7 years chasing down every little reference, every book, every article, right down to parish bulletins and you name it, and interviewing different players in all of this and discovering the different communities and who they are and where they are and how they came to be. And after about 7 years of this, I had reached a point where my knowledge of all of this was practically encyclopedic. And I realized I need to take what I've got and try to compress it down to just one book. Because I was beginning to think in terms of this whole great big series of books, based on my initial idea about who's who in traditional Catholicism, a book devoted to this pope, a book devoted to that priest, a book devoted to that bishop, and so on. And it's like, who would read anything that vast? I need to give one volume that kind of has everything. So in September of 1996, I sat down and began my initial draft of what ultimately became the resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church. So I worked on it and organized things. And eventually, by about the middle of 1998, I had my first full-length draft. But it still needed more work. And meanwhile, I'm starting to look for how I'm going to publish it. In 2002, I finally found a way to publish it. Well, self-published, but you have to start somewhere when you're an unknown. But at any rate, it's self-published at that time and came out in 2002. I kind of think of that as like the beta version of the book, but it was the first edition. And in 2004, I had a few major things, some historical things that happened, not the least of which was the incredible success and newsworthiness of the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of the Christ, which, moved a lot of people, not just Catholics, but a lot of people to repentance and so forth. It was, that was a very important event. And I had to be more conscious of the fact that the church is truly universal in being something that goes all over the whole world. So I had to incorporate that. Well, the 2004 edition, which incorporated that much, had remained the edition for a long time. But I had hoped that Catholic clergy would read this and realize something very important, which we'll get to as we get into the contents of the book, and be able to act on it and do what I think deep down every Catholic knows we all need to be doing. So when that didn't happen, I had to dig into the theology of it a lot more, because I picked up a lot, but sometimes you kind of have to, deduce stuff from very fragmentary information. And that kind of had, made for some cracks in my resurrection book. So finally, after I did some more research, that resulted in my 2-volume work, Sede Vacante, which we talked about the first volume. Eventually allowed me to refine a lot of what was in there. I come across some more useful historical information. It allowed me to right some wrongs that I had accidentally done, because I had to work with what I had and information-wise, and some of it was very limited. Now I had more hard facts to work with. So it was time. So in 2019, I went through the whole book and revised it to incorporate both the theological information and more historical information, more current events, as well as more accurate reporting of some of the older events as well. And so that's where we are as it stands now.
It is.
And that's kind of the history of me, my book, and I hope that is the answer we need.
So you see, everybody, he's put an awful lot of work into this book. It just didn't happen overnight. It's a big book, and it's not there for a midnight bedtime read. It's there to provoke. It's there to get you to think. That's what it's there for. So let's open up the book. There are 12 chapters to this book. And in addition to those chapters, there are numerous supplementary appendages. There's prefaces, there's epilogues, there's conclusion, there's a whole reference points. They all carry equal weight in the book. It's not just about looking at the 12 chapters, it's about looking at the whole book, all of it, from start to finish, to get the idea, the concept of what Griff is trying to get across to you. So now we're not going to go through the whole book. Griff and I have agreed to concentrate on certain areas which we think will highlight the book enough for you to have a meaningful insight, enough for you to go and say, okay, I need to go and get this book and have a look at it. At the same time, go and get Sede Vacante. Now, so Griff, let's take the audience on this epic journey of yours by visiting the preface and introduction sections of the book. As I said, it's not just about the 12 chapters, everybody. Now, you talk about Catholic priests who say the Latin Mass and teach sound doctrine. Any member of the ordinate practicing the above has been viewed, mischaracterized, or, with the word extremist or rightist, attached to them. And you mention Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a rebel, excommunicated, question mark. And you talk about Mel Gibson's film, which I've already mentioned briefly, The Passion of Christ. Tridentine Masses, pre-Vatican II. And you'll get this conversation, everybody, that Griff is not a Vatican II supporter, really. But you make your own minds up about that. Plus a whole host of other things. So, Griff, why the contents, to the preface and the introduction? So why are you leading the reader into the book with these opening gambits?
I see those parts as it's just very, very, very superficial introductory things, kind of to tell the reader, who is this for? Who is this about? And then as I run through various examples of various sorts of people who may meet up with this in one way or another, sometimes friendly, even sometimes not, but just a variety of different ways that people have encountered this. And probably I would hope and expect that at least my first and most initial readers will probably identify with one or another of the various people I describe in various situations. And so it's just to introduce the whole volume before we really start diving into the material proper. And that's really all there is to those. And that's the point of those. So I try to keep them mercifully quick. I think they are somewhat. Okay.
That bit is, everybody, but the chapters aren't, everyone. They're long. They have got quite awful lot of content in these chapters. So let's go to chapter 1. How to identify the Roman Catholic Church. Now that's a thought-provoking comment to start with. Here I find you talking about the church as the mystical body of Christ. The Pope is infallible. The church is indefectible. The gates of hell. And you also, as far as I can see, define, you go to most of your chapters, you've got part 1, and then you go to section with the holier, and then you've got Catholic, then you've got Apostolic, Church in sections. So why have you set the contents of this chapter out in this way? And what hard-hitting messages are you highlighting to the reader so early in this book of yours?
So the whole context of really everything I've written here and in any other books and other articles and whatnot that I have published over the years is exactly this. And it says at the conclusion of chapter 1, well, I'll get there in a moment. Chapter 1, we walk through how the church has classically always been recognized. These are all just straight from the standard doctrines of the church. They're written rather simply and maybe arguably somewhat simplistically because I'm trying to keep it short. But we all hear about the church, and it's right there in the creed. It's one, it's holy, it's Catholic, it's apostolic. What do these words mean? And how does that apply to what we see here? And we look for these characteristics. And the interesting thing is, and I prove this in far more depth in the Sede Vicante volume that we talked about elsewhere, that when you measure your local St. Miscellaneouses that you find in most buildings where it says Catholic Church on the front, and you go in there and it's like it could be an Episcopalian or a Methodist church for all you can tell from the atmosphere of the place. You see, whereas you go in any Catholic church that said Catholic on the door 70 years ago, as we speak now, and you would have found exactly what you find in every traditional Catholic parish to this day. And that's the same you would have found 570 years ago or 1,070 years ago. It never changed in its aspect. And then all of a sudden, Vatican II comes along and everything goes sideways. So the conclusion to that is that what I'm showing is my shocking finding, but this is what is the heart and soul of what the book is all about, is that the traditional Catholic community itself is the Catholic Church. It is the institutional church. It is the mystical body of Christ. It is exactly the direct continuation of that church, once so vast and so long, now reduced to a remnant in size, but it's still bearing its Catholic identity to a strong and very clear degree. And that is the point of the first chapter. So that sets the context for the whole rest of the book.
And you're right. When you do say the creed, you say, it's right there. One Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And that's what you find in this book of Griff's throughout all of his chapters. Those are a lot of the subheadings that he uses. And then he will apply the theme that is to that chapter. And of course, more older Catholics will probably believe in that the Pope is infallible. In other words, his teachings come from the truth and what one Pope says. And if another one comes on at a later date and says that wasn't true, that's false, then that puts a question mark on infallibility. And particularly for those who are not so eager to follow the old traditional ways, they probably do question infallibility, especially after Vatican Council II. So, Griff, I get the sense, and I've said this before, and I think I said it in the last interview, you're not an advocate of post-Vatican II Council. It's very clear. And you're probably one of the old Catholics that way inclined. You're very much encamped pre-Vatican II. And in chapter 3, the judicial impact of the Second Vatican Council, or how the hierarchy lost control, means a lot to you personally. Would you care to expand, on your points of view here, to the audience? What's the reader going to get and ascertain from you in this chapter?
Okay. Now, in chapter 3, I'm trying to get a way for the ordinary reader. Again, this is meant for the ordinary Joe six-pack, man in the street. He has a family to feed. So I'm taking this from the very beginning that how do we explain something that people did not understand? So what I really believe has happened, and in fact, if we were to get to the Seti Vacante Volume 2, it would be all about this and expanding what's in Chapter 3 here to an immense amount of detail and depth, showing all of what's going on in there and documenting every step of the way. But here, all I can do is kind of an amateurish, layman's perspective, worm's eye view of what it is that's going on, and present the idea that during Vatican II, they had a document, they called it a constitution even, called Lumen Gentium. And by it, they redefined the nature of their society as a society to be something that of itself is not the church. So they actually split it into two. There is still the real church, which, interestingly enough, is described as one holy Catholic apostolic, also the pillar and mainstay of the church and so on, and that's actually us traditionalists, you see. And then this thing is not, but only, as they say, subsists in. Well, if one thing subsists in another, first of all, they are two distinct items. Second of all, there is implied maybe an overlap, but they are no longer of the same extent. So you could say, quite truthfully, that the Catholic Church subsists in some same name a secular nation. All right, I'll say it subsists in America. But you wouldn't dare say it subsists as America as if they were the same thing, but only in, because there are Catholics who live in America, are Americans, and practice their faith. But it also subsists in Ireland and England and Bolivia, any nation you care to name practically, as long as there's any Catholics there at all, because that's the nature of the church. And subsist is just a stronger form of exist. A thing can exist until it is destroyed. When subsist is used in a theological sense, that talks about an existence that cannot be destroyed. The fact that 2 and 2 makes 4 could be regarded as a kind of subsistence because that fact cannot be destroyed. There's no way to do it. So it's kind of like that. So that's one thing. And then there's this other thing that it subsists in, which is now their organization now as this new thing, this new society that by its very self-definition is in the same category as any society that even a former part of a church wherein its leader, say the Patriarch of Constantinople or say the King of England, suddenly says, we're not under the Pope anymore. We're going to be, on our own. And they made it official. And basically that spoke for everybody under them and wanted to stay under their chain of authority. as opposed to the few rare Catholics you found in these places that wanted no part of that and wanted to stay by Rome in those days. So you create a schism, you create a division, and part of it is the church is still under the Pope, is still infallible and defectible, and part of it now is really this brand new society, a brand new church, as it were, comprised of former resources of what had been the Catholic Church. Now it's no longer that. Once it's not the church, it's in the same status as any other schismatic body. It will drift off into errors, heresies, whatever, because it doesn't have the divine protection. The divine protection does not apply to it. So that's basically chapter 3 in a very teeny tiny nutshell, which itself is a rather smaller nutshell of what the second set of the Cante volume drills into in probably more detail than many people would probably care to go. But it's like you got answers to every question there. Anyway, what we have here in chapter 3 is a simple view of things, and I think it explains what has happened.
I told you, everybody, yes, he's got some very strong viewpoints. And yes, when you go into Sede Vacante Volume 2, which we've covered off in a previous interview, he does go into this area in a lot more detail, because this book was first. But there you go. I told you, he's got a lot of views. You need to read the book, see them all, and make your own mind up. The area of the book around chapter 5, Old Catholics, you like those, East Orthodox, and the spectre of dissent. Interesting word. To the overriding concept of your book. When I look at this chapter, I see you mention Thomas Kramer, Henry VIII, rock music, Christology, the Gencentis, if I've got that pronunciation right, the writings of St. Augustine, and of course the present Pope, Leo XIV, is from the Augustinians, Eastern Apostolic Patriarchs, Eastern Catholic rites, Thomastic theology, and the existence of purgatory, plus a whole host of other issues, debatable issues, everybody. So I want to ask you, Griff, how important is this chapter, this area of the book, to the overall context of the book?
Now, this chapter is kind of the end of basically the first 5 chapters are describing the whys and wherefores of who we are and why we are doing what we are doing. And basically a kind of worldview that explains the whole fact of traditional Catholics being the church, as we saw in chapter 1. And in chapter 3, we saw why or how this would be or could be, and probably it was, I believe was. Chapter 4, which we skipped over, shows all the a whole bunch of the differences between what is Catholic and what is, what I'm going to say, Novus Ordo, new order, part of this whole new religion invented as a result of Vatican II. And really, that has followed the same pattern as all the other dissenting and sectarian and even heretical voices over the years. So the chapter 5 is kind of the culmination of that. Now, you use an expression about old Catholics. Now, we want to separate out 2 different things here, very important here. You say, I'm old in the sense that I'm an old school Catholic. I'm the kind of Catholic that would have been just any Catholic before Vatican II came along. So that's exactly it. That's my cloth. That's the cloth I'm cut out of, you see. But that's not to be confused with another particular group. They call themselves Old Catholics, or some subset of them will even call themselves Old Roman Catholics, but they're not talking about age. They're actually talking about a schism that started in Utrecht, Netherlands, Holland, and in Utrecht. Basically, they didn't like some of the things that were going on in the real Catholic Church. So they started this little group of their own. It got a little more feed and momentum when some people reacted against, the First Vatican Council. Oh, how can popes be infallible and all this kind of stuff? And they started raising a lot of different ideas that heretics groups had already started. And they call themselves Old Catholics, but that is a specific identifiable group, which is one of the groups I'm talking about in chapter 5. So what happens is there's a pattern, and there's more, but I'm going to have to just get, but there's a pattern. When you create some sort of a schism, a heresy, something like that, you always end up having to do something, to change something, to set yourself apart, you see, from, in this case, the Catholic Church, the real Catholic Church, the original one that, that has always been and that, we are. And that is, you change stuff. And I mean, let's look at the one in England. After it was all on their own and no longer under the Pope, well, they changed their liturgy. They vernacularized it. They simplified their prayers. They cut out some doctrines that the Catholics had always believed, and that they decided, we don't believe these doctrines, including infallibility of the Pope, most notably, and other doctrines, merits of the saints, etc., etc. They cut out a number of doctrines that they didn't like. And so they had to change stuff, because if you're going to create a bootleg of something, as long as the original's there, what do you need with the bootleg? Just go to the original, Why are you going to buy a knockoff, say a copy of some famous brand of, say, a fashion purse that a lady might carry, and it looks like this famous brand that costs $1,000 or more just for a purse, but it's a name brand and it's well made and so forth. Now somebody's going to make a knockoff. Well, why are you going to buy the knockoff? You got to have something different, like, well, this knockoff has more space inside. It has a more clever kind of clasp to it. It's got some design on it that, you see, you put something on it so as to be something the original doesn't have, so as to say, you should buy this. It's better because it's different in these important ways. See what I'm saying? And every sect has done that to some degree. And the Novus Ordo sect, created at Vatican II, has done the same thing, exactly the same thing. And this is the pattern that goes throughout all of that. So that's how chapter 5 is like the capstone to everything we've been saying so far.
It's a bit like, yes, we know here in the UK, Henry VIII, because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, and the Pope said no, because he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. So he decided, well, we'll break off from the Catholic Church and we'll head up the Church of England. And I'll make myself the head of the church. And of course, that's why over in here we have the King James Version of the Bible, as opposed to the, the more Catholic tradition version of the Bible. It's slightly different context to it. And, it's like in Europe, particularly if you go up to the Scandinavian countries, you've got the Lutherans church, again, a splintering off. In Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark, Finland, they follow very much, when you go into one of their churches, they're very simplistic, very plain, and not as ornate as you'll find in some of the Catholic churches. So they are the splinter ones there, and this is what I think Griff is getting at here. Because I do know some Catholics say, well, we are the true root right back to St. Peter's Day. But again, have a look at the chapter, have a look at the book, see what you think to what Griff has said, and make your own mind up. Now, Griff, in our conversations prior to doing this interview, I suggested we focus on chapter 9. The advance of Sede Vacantis. You came back and said, rather than just following on, just focusing on chapter 9, that we should have a broader concept, a broader chat here, so as that chapters 6, 7, and 11 can be incorporated here. Because you've linked them all up. You said this would be more fitting. Okay, so I said, yeah, let's run with it. because you want to stress the various traditional Catholic communities and their histories and their distinctions. So my question to you is, in brief, Griff, bearing in mind you're covering off a fair proportion of the book here, what do you want to convey to the audience, to the reader, about this section of the book?
So, starting with chapter 6, this is where we pass from the whys and wherefores to the actual history of the church. So, in chapter 6, it's kind of like the boat has just sunk, and people are still swimming around looking for lifeboats or bits of driftwood that they can hang on to, and maybe looking for other fellow survivors. And it's kind of a, like the beginning after a disaster, but people are wanting to keep the truth and forget about even trying to figure out what's going on. Just let's try to hang on to what we know is right. And that's what they can do. And we'll kind of pull together and so forth. Then we'll start working on that, what went on or what happened to us afterwards. Did we hit an iceberg or what? So those are the things they couldn't really think about too much. So as a direct outgrowth of that, we move into chapter 7, where probably the first of the most prominent groups gathers around Archbishop Lefebvre, which is the Society of St. Pius X. And their idea is, we're not really going to get into the big questions, but we know what we need to do, and we're going to focus on what obviously and clearly has to be the right praxis. We're going to continue the church with real bishops who are really consecrated and not what goes on in the Novus Ordo, where there is considerable room to doubt the validity of even their attempts to make bishops and priests and so forth. So we're going to do that. We're going to train our priests truly how Catholic priests were always trained, and not what they do now, which brainwashes them into another religion. We're going to have seminaries. We're going to have religious congregations of men and women, also doing things. And we're going to have ordinary parish-type congregations in as far around the world as possible to bring the Catholicism people once knew. And that was what was going on. Now, that's one solution. Meanwhile, let me skip over to chapter 11, where we talk about what I call the Indultarians, or now motu proprio. And what happened was the Vatican organization was seeing this happening and seeing that they're losing people to the traditional church. And so they came up with an idea, and it kind of grew. And I document the growth of that in chapter 11 of, well, all right, let's start having little Latin Mass congregations of our own. And so in a few isolated locations here and there, somebody with one of their bishops, or I consider them just functionaries, would say, let's have a Latin Mass right here. And they allow it. And in time, even a full parish-type congregation with all the sacraments in their traditional forms. And it's with us, modernists, you see, but it's going to look Catholic. And for those going to it, many simply want to find a real Mass, and maybe that's the closest to where they live, or the only one near where they live, or maybe the only one they're psychologically prepared to go to, whatever the case may be. And they go there, and they have the real Mass, or I would say at least something that looks enough like the real Mass that by it they're still professing the Catholic faith publicly. And so I have to count them as Catholics. Some people would say, oh, that's not very Catholic because they're going with invitations. They should know their sponsors of these particular congregations are the modernist heretics. Yes, but this could be viewed from two standpoints. The heretics set these things up to compete with the other Catholic churches that are not under their control, kind of like gas station price wars, But on the other hand, the people who go there, they're not going there because they want to, fight the other traditional Catholics. They're going there with a hope that they could kind of establish the true faith on the borders and edges of a society that obviously has become non-Catholic. In a way, you could kind of see them as like the soldiers on the beaches of Normandy landing there and they're out to conquer the Hitlerian government that has taken over so much of Europe. But now they're just landing on the beach and trying to establish a beachhead. And I think many Indotarians, even many of the clergy who went into that, had that goal in life. They wanted to bring the Catholic faith back to this society that had become non-Catholic, and they had hoped that they would be able to do it. I think the hope is kind of wearing awfully thin now, but at least it's a reasonable hope. And I cannot challenge the motives of those who were hoping to do this. So now in more recent years, instead of what they call an Indo, there was a motu proprio in 2007, which actually granted rather broad and generous provisions for this. It really looked like maybe this could happen. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could restore that whole big society to the Catholic faith. And so they invented something called the extraordinary form, which just means you do the real Latin Mass, which I guess is kind of extraordinary, instead of what they sell as a Mass, that's a crudely Mass-like service on par with a Lutheran Mass or, whatever. But at any rate, so you have these two different forms. Well, that didn't go over very well. They got some people with that, but they also lost others to that from their new religion, and that's not what they wanted. They really don't want people to be Catholics. They just want to pretend. Let's pretend we're Catholics for a bit. Well, the pretense can wear thin in some places. So that's the other group. And then when we get to the other one, there was the fact that we need to start trying to understand theologically what is going on. And this brings us to the third group, the chapter 9, and that is the Sedevacantist community. And that's where we study. Did you know that there is a dogma that says a heretic cannot be pope? Even if an actual pope somehow got it in his head to try to teach a heresy to the whole church and impose it, he would, in that very act, lose his hold on the papacy. It would be is the same as if you were to say, I quit, I'm done, I'm gone, I'm over, I resign. It's exactly the same. He's out of that office. He has stepped out of it. So that's a dogma. And if you apply that dogma, you look what the church has taught before. There are dogmas. And I'll give you one dogma. The war between God and Satan, good and evil, is a dogmatic war. This isn't a mere discipline or a nice idea or a little doctrine or teaching of the church. This is dogma. And now, from the ancient days of the Israelites, the gods of the nations were all incognitos of Satan and the demons. Now, all of a sudden, you get to Vatican II, and every other religion out there suddenly becomes not an incognito of the devils and demons, but an incognito of the true God. So, and that is the crux at what makes the Novus Ordo religion what it is, and why it's something that a Catholic who is serious about his faith really cannot afford to be affiliated with that if he wants to save his soul. So, when you change something like that, that is called heresy. You contradict a dogma, that's the mark of a heretic. And so, if a heretic, and we know they're doing this, everyone, certainly from Paul VI, with some suspicion hovering over John the 23rd, and certainly Paul VI and everyone else is walking this new way of treating every heretic, every heathen, every pagan, everybody out there. They're all serving the true God in their own way. As in, God didn't present a religion to mankind, as the Bible teaches. God just kind of says, well, you guys come up with whatever religion things seems good to you, and that'll be good enough to please me. Yeah. I don't see that idea anywhere in the Bible, but that's really what the Vatican II religion is all about. So when you have this, reaction, what does that say about a person who purports to be a pope, but teaches these heresies and other heresies as well? This is the most, dire, direct, and notable. It means he's a heretic, which by the dogma means he is not a pope. And this is why we call a sedevacantus, a person who knows that the papal chair is obviously vacant because these people who pretend to occupy it are heretics, therefore do not really obtain it. And it doesn't seem to be anybody else functioning in that capacity either. So we say that the church has no pope. So that's why you start to get theological. And then that's where Sedevacante Volume 1 comes in, because there's a whole lot more theology can should teach us.
Oh, there is, everybody. There's a whole lot more. So you were brief there, and that was very good for you. And yes, I do understand, religions have branched off from the main Catholic branch, in Methodists, Baptists, all sorts of organizations, which are quite recently done. But I was fascinated because you've dedicated part of the book, conclusion. And I was intrigued, shall I say, why you subheaded it, we belong to Rome and Rome is ours. And I'm really fascinated with some of the points that you raised, like, since the church must always exist, the characteristics and marks of the church also must exist. And your comment under the section, the church is the mystical body of Christ, and what that has in common to the actual body of Christ. I thought, that's interesting. And most notably, we've touched on this, is the issue, the talk about in the section, the Pope is infallible. One Pope, as I said already early on in the interview, is declaring something is the truth, and then we get a later Pope contradicting that, claiming it to be false. A and Y, you've got them in the book as Pope A and Pope Y. And you go on again about the more traditional understandings of Catholicism, believing in papal infallibility against those which shall say maybe have more liberal views. So the conclusion part of this book is quite powerful. Is that why you put it in?
Okay, yes. So I'm bringing up those same 4 marks of the church as a kind of bookend to what we saw back in chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have now described the church, and yes, there are distinct communities. This is not the first time this has happened. There was the first great Western schism of the 12 and 1300s, where we had 2 and then even 3 claimants to the papacy. Now, these 2 and 3 men who did call themselves popes were at least Catholics. So you could have followed any one of them into all the truths of the church. But there's not supposed to be multiple popes. And this was a big problem for the church. And every Catholic knew it's not supposed to be this way. Our pope is the right one, or our pope, And each group believed their own was the right pope. And there were strong reasons for each one of them in one way or another. So they had to find a solution to that, which they did. And that's kind of what needs to happen now, because every Catholic, whether he's some layman going to the indult or motu proprio mass of today, the extraordinary form, is, first he's trying to just do something Catholic on Sunday mornings for himself and his family. But second of all, he's hoping to be part of a beachhead of Catholicism on this. Good for him on that. It's hopeless, but I will not challenge or question the motive. You've got the Pius X group that have gone ahead and started everything and run all the things that need to be done so the church has the organizational and community infrastructure to really pick up and carry on, however long it takes till things get resolved and whatever that resolution is going to be. They don't want to try to judge the Pope question. In fact, they tend to argue against that, and that's one of the weaknesses of that position. Every position has its weaknesses, but that's still, people involve themselves in these things because they want to do the true church and they want to do the right thing, and they're doing to the best of their ability, given what they know, which may be rather limited, what they have access to in terms of where they live and what, if anything, of any category is reasonably where they can go on a Sunday. And finally, if they can think about stuff and start looking into the theology of it all, you have the Sedevacantist community who are doing that. So all of these things, are really part of the same church. We all understand if there was an actual real pope who's truly a Catholic, we would all cheerfully fall in line behind him. And that right there shows that the separation is only a material separation, not a formal one. Formal one is where you say, I'm going to kick away from you because you're something, we're going to be one thing and I'm going to be another. But a non-formal, only material schism is something that happens accidentally and can be, and I believe will be, restored. So that's
the conclusion. And I'm interested. You said a couple of times, on a Sunday, and I'd argue the point there. Following a religion is not just about one day. It's your life. It's the way you lead your life. And you can go to church any day of the week you want to. Yes, it is predominantly focused on a Sunday, like, with the Muslim religion, it's Friday. With the Jewish religion, it's Saturday. The Christian one is Sunday. But you can go anytime you like. That's my point of view. But also...
you bring up a good point there. Obviously, Sunday is only one part of it.
It is only one part of it.
There's no point in doing the right thing on Sunday if you're not doing it the rest of the week. But that's kind of a given. At least I'm seeing it that way.
Yeah. Now, Griff, as I said right from the beginning, yes, there are 12 chapters, but just as equal weight throughout the book, there are other sections of the book that you need to look at. And in particular, the appendages to this book. There's Appendage A, the Pope condemns Vatican II, and Appendage B, questions and objections. Now, these take up a fair bit of the book. Why have you put the appendages in? What's the point?
So the first appendix is an attempt to document from teachings of the popes on a number of ways where the Novus Ordo religion in its more obvious aspects, contradicts the ways of the Catholic Church. Pope, name the Pope, most of them are more recent ones, Pius X, Pius XI, but also others, maybe Benedict XV, and maybe Julius III, and so forth. We also condemn certain practices that were growing up maybe among the Protestants or other dissident groups. This is wrong. This is bad. This should be condemned. And I do condemn it as Pope or whatever. And then you see the Vatican II, you can see for yourself that they do the same things that were already condemned. So even though Vatican II as a council, as a historical event, did not exist in the lives of these previous popes of the church, they saw bits and pieces of it in the various dissenting groups and sects and so forth, and responded to that, which is them, what would these popes say if they saw the Vatican II church today? So that's pretty much that in a nutshell.
So go and have a look at the appendages, everybody.
Next one, question and answers. People like questions and answers.
They do.
There was a wonderful series of books, which I cannot praise highly enough, called Radio Replies, mostly by Father Leslie Rumble. There's also Mortimer Carty, who kind of helped out a little bit. And again, it's all questions and answers about the church, about the faith, and so forth. And people like to read that sort of thing because that's how it was actually presented on the air. They call it Radio Replies because he went on the air, on the radio in 1928 and just started reading questions that people had sent in, and then he answered them. And that was the whole show. And he did that for, I think, into the 1960s. So, and just collected a lot of this stuff into 5 books, just full of replies. So it's a neat kind of thing. And there's always questions people will have. And sometimes one can get into some details that the basic narrative really doesn't get into. Like, how did Archbishop Kung, live and die? He was persecuted in China, suffered in a prison there for 30 years or something. and was only let out shortly before he died. And, how did he die and so forth. And little details like that are not even in the main narrative. So it's a real opportunity for more. And the other stuff is for people to discover for themselves. But I think it's also neat stuff.
So I think everybody, we've given you fair ideas to what you could expect from this book. It's controversial. It's got viewpoints, strong viewpoints. You need to read it, formulate your own ideas, and make up your own answers. Griff Ruby, thank you very much for coming on the show and talking to us about your latest book.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been as great as I hoped.
You're very welcome. I'm Jetty Crowley. Thanks for listening, watching, wherever in the world. Until next time, stay safe.